All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started here to make the most of our time and our very special distinguished guests. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Inboden. I'm a distinguished scholar here with the Strauss Center and also a professor on the LBJ faculty. And this is a bittersweet moment. Bitter because it's the last of our distinguished lecture series this year, but sweet because we have such a wonderful guest in Andrew Shearer. So. I first got to know Andrew when he was the National Security Advisor to former Australian Prime Minister John Howard, and I was working at the National Security Council for the U.S. White House, and we worked together on a number of alliance issues, and I found him to be just a delightful friend and colleague and interlocutor. He is currently a distinguished scholar and director of studies at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, which is one of Australia's leading foreign policy think tanks. Before that, as I mentioned, he was the National Security Advisor to the Australian Prime Minister. He was one of the top officials at Australia's embassy in Washington, and before that had a number of other senior positions with the Australian Defence Ministry, Foreign Ministry, and Intelligence Community. On a personal level, I found him to be one of the most thoughtful and perceptive observers from down under on American geopolitics and foreign policy and politics in general. So I always love getting a sanity check from him because we never a shortage of need for sanity checks, certainly in U.S. politics. But he's also a very perceptive observer of political and economic and security issues in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's one of the things he'll be focusing on today in his remarks. So please give a warm Austin welcome to Andrew Shearer.
Thanks, Sir. Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to start really by thanking Will and Frank for the very kind invitation to come to Austin. It's my first visit, and I'm delighted to be here. And I'm very honoured to be part of this Strauss Center International Security Speaker Series, in particular because I'm following in the footsteps of some of my good friends and colleagues, including Celeste Ward and Juan Zarate, and also people with much bigger brains than me, like Phil Zellicoe. What I want to do is skip past all the usual comparisons between Australia and Texas, because you've heard them all before, and just perhaps it suffices to say that it feels great to be here and I feel very much at home in Austin. Today I want to talk about Asia, or perhaps more correctly about the Indo-Pacific, but it would be remiss of me not to congratulate America's intelligence agencies and military forces on this week's painstakingly prepared and brilliantly executed operation to eliminate Osama bin Laden. It's clear that the war on terror isn't over, and it's also clear, I think, that America's intelligence agencies and military have been much maligned in recent years, often unfairly. And I owe it, I think, to my many friends and associates there in that community to acknowledge their stunning success. Along with the US-led overthrow of the Taliban and of Saddam Hussein, remember him, the elimination of UBL could, when combined with the still unfolding Arab Spring, at long last help to tilt events in the Middle East in a favourable direction. It would certainly be about time. Should this occur, it would also help to free up much needed US time, energy and resources and allow them to be brought to bear fully on the other major strategic challenge of the 21st century, the shift of international power to and within Asia. And, as I'll argue today, not a moment too soon. US power, particularly military and economic power, has underpinned more than 60 years of extraordinary growth and development right across Asia, through the Cold War and for more than 2 decades since. In the process, it's underwritten one of the most extraordinary stories, I think, in human history, how hundreds of millions of people in Asia have been lifted out of poverty and misery. And contrary to the proponents of cultural relativism and confected notions of Asian values, we've also seen an extraordinary embrace in Asia of democracy, with one or two holdouts. The system in which Asia has flourished was undergirded by the US bilateral alliance system, by forward-deployed US military power, and by strong US support for an open international economy. Put simply, countries in Asia look to America for two things: security and markets. Key to this system's success has been that American power has been so completely dominant throughout this period that no other power has thought it worth its while to challenge the United States in a serious way. It's often forgotten now that in the 1980s there was talk that Japan might pose such a challenge, and the bookshops were full of stories about, guess what, America's decline and Japan's rise, with titles like The Coming War with Japan. All of that seems a long time ago as the Japanese economic miracle fizzled and accounts of American decline proved well wide of the mark. America's allies and friends during this period have been freed by the American security umbrella to plough their own resources into national development rather than security. This was exemplified, of course, by Japan, which under the Yoshida Doctrine accepted strategic subservience to America, in return focusing on economic development, spending as little as 1% on defence, 1% of GDP on defence, while becoming the lead goose, if I could put it that way, in Asia's flying geese. China was also free to focus behind Japan on development, and at least until recently has been following Deng Xiaoping's famous injunction to bide its time. Few countries have benefited from this dispensation as much as Australia, but the US has also been a major beneficiary. Unfortunately for all of us, this system is today under serious challenge for the first time, creating uncertainty across Asia. With the shift of global power away from the Northern Atlantic towards Asia and the Pacific, the potential ramifications of this shift are global. They will require major shifts in US and allied strategy and resources. The outcome will determine not only the future Asian order, but also the shape of the international system. It's become a commonplace that the simultaneous growth of China and India is shifting the global balance of power. I won't blind you with statistics, but just take one quick factoid. At current rates of growth, every year China and India add 40 million people to the global workforce. It's the equivalent of injecting a France into the world economy every year. We simply aren't used to this. Since Da Gama, Western power has shaped events in Asia according to Western notions of order. But this is likely to change. Because of Asia's rapidly growing economic weight, events in Asia will increasingly shape the global economy and security order. We can see this already in the establishment of the G20. We can see it too in China's massive holdings of US dollar bonds, and in recent CIPRI data showing that while defence spending is falling in Europe, it is rising in Asia. The natural effect of China's rapid growth, in particular, is to close the relative power gap with the United States, albeit from a very long way back. In 2009, for example, China's economy was still only about a third the size of America's. In GDP terms, China's per capita GDP was only 8% of America's. That year, the US accounted for 43% of global defence spending, China an estimated 6.6%. But this process is accelerating, and that's largely because of the global financial crisis and the ensuing economic downturn in the United States, which has left China as the only major locomotive for world economic growth. China is now the major trading partner of virtually all Asian countries, including key US allies such as Japan, South Korea and Australia. And the perception of China's rise is moving ahead of this reality. We've seen Chinese officials openly criticising US economic policy, something which would have been unthinkable even 2 or 3 years ago. It was demand for raw materials from China that pulled Australia through the global financial crisis without going into recession, one of very few Western countries to achieve that. And no wonder, perhaps, that despite the reality I talked about of China's economy being roughly a third the size of America's, 55% of Australians today think that China is the world's leading economic power. A similar story pertains to military power. China's military modernisation is outpacing Western estimates. China's producing a range of sophisticated capabilities designed to deny the Western Pacific approaches to Asia to other navies, in particular, of course, the US Navy, which has dominated those waters ever since the Battle of Midway. These include a large fleet of modern submarines, a profusion of ballistic and cruise missiles, and advanced fighter aircraft. The recent one rolled out in something that doesn't look like a coincidence during Secretary Gates' recent visit to China. Perhaps emboldened by these military advances, China is behaving much more assertively in the East China Sea and the South China Sea in support of its restrictive interpretation of international maritime law, much to the discomfort of its neighbours. By contrast to this story, the western side of the ledger, it has to be said, looks pretty bleak. I don't need to tell this audience that the US economy is struggling with high unemployment and a budget situation that everyone agrees is unsustainable, but that no one can agree on how to fix. The Obama administration recently announced major cuts to the US defence budget. I've just come back from Japan, where the earthquake has delivered yet another major blow to the confidence of America's most important Asian ally, recently overtaken in economic size by China, and already weakened by its stagnant economy and sclerotic politics. Some are talking about Japan now being set irrevocably on a trajectory of gradual decline, much as we saw in Britain after the Second World War. South Korea has its own problems, of course, particularly an understandable preoccupation with its erratic northern neighbour. Southeast Asia is being held back by unruly domestic politics, institutional weakness and corruption, and now a border conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. And in my view, India is also largely preoccupied by internal challenges, domestic economic and political problems, and is yet to establish itself as a reliable, constructive international partner. Regional institutions in Asia are weak and struggling. For example, APEC, which the United States is hosting this year in Honolulu. And we've seen troubling portents of protectionism and a lack of US leadership on trade policy, although we'll have to wait and see what comes of the Trans-Pacific Partnership at the end of the year. So all around, there are certainly grounds for pessimism about Asia's future, and this is leading some serious scholars, including my colleague Hugh White back in Australia, to argue that the United States should reach an accommodation with China now, while it still enjoys some leverage. I'm a little more optimistic than this, though. When my colleagues and I at the Lowy Institute wrote a paper on Asia's security future, we deliberately called it Power and Choice. Power is shifting in Asia, but we do have choices, albeit many of them difficult and unpalatable and made harder by weak and divided governments, including in Japan and Australia and the United States. Power shifts will transform Asia, but it's the choices made by Asia's great powers, and by America in particular, that will determine how the region is transformed. The strategic situation in Asia is difficult but far from hopeless. The US economy is feeble, and defence cuts will feed the anxieties of allies, including Australia. But America is resilient, and despite political divisions, the political mood, it seems to me, in America is for tackling the budget deficit. China's economic growth, in my view, is unsustainable at its present level, and it faces a very difficult transition to a new economic model based on domestic consumption. Meanwhile, inflation is a major challenge for the Chinese leadership, as are inequality, corruption, environmental degradation, all of which are feeding growing social unrest in China. The most recent sign of this is the Chinese leadership's panicky reaction to the Arab Spring and their crackdown on dissent in China, the toughest we've seen in the last 2 decades. This, I would argue, highlights not the party's power, but the brittleness of its rule inside China. I'm also optimistic because while experts often seem to assume that the US is a passive object in this equation rather than an active subject, America is responding to this challenge. For more than a decade, it's been moving forces from Europe to the Pacific. More than half of America's aircraft carrier fleet is now located in the Pacific, and something like 60% of its submarine fleet. America's building up a major regional base in Guam. The United States is adapting its alliances with Japan, South Korea and Australia, albeit not without problems, and is starting to network those allies in new ways, starting with intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance systems. Regional countries are responding to this growing uncertainty too. They're developing their own defence capabilities. Just recently we've seen Australia, Japan and Vietnam make major new announcements about submarine acquisitions. And many countries around Asia are not moving closer to China, as many thought would be the case, but rather closer to the United States. After the brief and unsuccessful experiment of Prime Minister Hatoyama, this includes Japan, certainly includes South Korea under President Lee Myung-bak, it includes Singapore and Indonesia, and it even includes an old American enemy, Vietnam. Since John Howard's government in Australia, which I was part of, Australia too has been adapting its alliance, focusing on interoperable weapon systems and capabilities. And it's no coincidence, I think, that in this more uncertain regional environment, our polling at the Lowy Institute shows that Australian public support for the US alliance is at record highs. Another reason why I'm quietly confident is that there are significant limitations to China's growing power. When I left government and started work in a think tank, much of the discourse was about China's amazing soft power and how it was bewitching Asia. Well, that story lasted less than 2 years. It turns out that China's soft power was badly exaggerated. And in reality, China has few genuine friends in Asia or beyond. And those friends it does have are countries like North Korea and Burma, hardly good company. China is learning too that its assertiveness is counterproductive. After the Chonan sinking, the sinking of the South Korean warship, Beijing refused to condemn North Korea. As a result of that, public opinion towards China, previously quite favourable, turned decisively and I think perhaps finally against China in South Korea. In Australia, even though 3/4 of the population welcome China's economic growth for the benefits it brings to us in terms of our standards of living and our economy, 44% of Australians think that there is a reasonable chance that China will threaten us militarily in the next 2 decades. So nearly half of Australians think that our major trading partner might attack us in the next 20 years. It's a stark statistic and one that China's leaders should give careful thought. We do need to be concerned about China's military and especially about the lack of clarity around its long-term strategic goals. But I still see China's military power as essentially coercive rather than expansionist in its intent. Although, of course, if you're being coerced, coercion is nothing to be happy about. It's a very different thing, though, to have an aircraft carrier capability, the way the United States does, for example, than it is to have an aircraft carrier, as China might have in 2015. This is causing enormous excitement around the defence wonk community. But it took America decades to develop sophisticated aircraft carrier operations to the level they're at now, and it will take China, in my view, decades before it comes even close. And the same applies with a whole lot of other areas of capability. China is deficient in joint operating ability and still very deficient in the ability to project serious military power a long way from China, and even more difficult to sustain it there. So we shouldn't be spooked. For me, the key here is for the United States and for its allies to hold the ring for the next decade, not to lose our nerve, and certainly not to come to any premature accommodation with China that's inconsistent with our values or with our long-term strategic interests. I don't want to sound Macauberish, but the longer we manage to maintain a favourable balance of power in Asia, the more chance there is that events will turn in our favour. Who knows? We could see another phase of innovation-driven high growth in the United States. We could see the collapse of North Korea and the reunification of the peninsula. We could even see genuine economic and political reform in China. After all, most Arabists told us that we would never see an Arab Spring. So what should we do over the next 10 years? Perhaps it's not surprising to hear it from one of your allies, but the lodestar of US policy should be reassuring its Asian allies. Key to this will be restoring America's fiscal situation to sustainability, and doing so without major defence cuts, which I'm afraid will mean difficult choices in domestic policy areas. America needs to maintain its very high level of support for Japan after the earthquake. When I was in Japan, everyone I spoke to warmly welcomed America's military relief effort, which included some 40,000 American troops and 16 American warships. For the first time, I think, ordinary Japanese people came to understand the practical benefits of the alliance rather than seeing it simply as an imposition and something that served American and not Japanese interests. America will also need to keep in mind that its alliance with Japan is bigger than the current difficulties over Futenma, the airbase in Okinawa, and it should continue to privately push Japan to reform and support those efforts. America should also, in my view, put South Korean and Japanese views at the core of its North Korea policy, rather than Beijing's, which I think has been a flaw in previous efforts. It would be a mistake, in my view, to give the North Koreans something more just to get them back to the six-party talks once again. America needs to continue to give Taiwan the defence equipment and the diplomatic support that it requires to maintain the status quo and its tenuous hold in the international system. The US should continue to reinvigorate and adapt its force posture, which will include, I think, more of a presence and more access arrangements in Australasia and in Southeast Asia. As the power gap closes, the US is going to have to keep shifting a greater proportion of its military power to the Indo-Pacific to maintain a favourable balance in Asia. This will require prevailing in Afghanistan and Libya and not throwing away the gains made in Iraq. It will also require ensuring that concepts like the air-sea battle doctrine under development in the Pentagon avoid the risk of strategic decoupling. The US forward presence will remain vital to reassuring your allies. Your allies have to be convinced that the US has serious skin in the game. In other words, the US has to find just the right posture in Asia. Not too far forward, not too far back. Kind of the Goldilocks formula. America needs to take more steps to network its allies. It can do this starting in the area of intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, but also in anti-submarine warfare, which is going to become more important, in strategic lift, as we've seen with US, Japanese and Australian assets operating after the earthquake in Japan, and in missile defence. We shouldn't shy away from values-based cooperation, and sub-regional groups are important here, like the trilateral strategic dialogue between America, Australia and Japan. We should be patient with India, despite setbacks like we've seen in the Doha round and also the recent aircraft acquisition decision, which I think is very unfortunate and short-sighted of the Indian government. And we should be firm, clear and consistent with China on things that really matter, including human rights and transparency. Working with like-mindeds, the United States can show leadership in regional organisations to support each other's positions and coordinate on difficult issues, like the quest to find rules of the road for maritime Asia, so that some of these incidents that we're seeing more and more often don't spill over inadvertently into conflict. Above all, I think America's Asian allies want consistency and clarity of purpose from America, as we've seen recently from Secretary Clinton at ASEAN over the South China Sea, and when the US announced that it would cover the Senkakus under the US-Japan Defence Alliance. China is going to continue to probe, looking for weakness on the part of the United States and its allies. And it's very important, in my view, that the US avoids weak moments, as we've seen where it set various red lines, for example, for North Korea, only to see them stepped over without consequence. I've talked a lot about America's responsibilities, but of course, it's not fair, reasonable or sensible for your Asian allies to allow the United States to bear the entire burden. Allies have their own responsibilities. Japan needs to recognise that its differences with America over basing are a regional concern, not just a bilateral one. The ROK needs to keep up the momentum towards its more active global role, and it remains to be seen whether this will survive a change of government in Seoul. Nor can Australia rest on its laurels. We have at the moment a weak minority government lacking in policy direction, and we need to step up on questions like access for US maritime and air forces, intelligence and missile defence. All of America's allies are going to need to work with America in regional institutions instead of their periodic flirtations with East Asia only exclusive regional institutions. They'll need to keep building their own defence capabilities and ensuring that they can operate freely with each other as well as with the United States. And we need to get on with the serious work of trade and economic reform in Asia and standing up for our values. This, with American leadership, will be the best way to ensure that Asia enjoys another 60 years of peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Andrew's now happy to entertain questions from the audience, so I'm sure there are plenty from those very provocative and thoughtful remarks. So.
Yeah, Andrew, you spoke about the Institute's work on power and choice in Asia. I wonder if you could apply that metric to the Sino-Japanese relationship from both perspectives. A few years ago, it looked like Japanese elites were actually grappling with what they saw as a choice of the role they would play, either continued firm alliance with the United States or a more assertive national role. Has that choice now been made decisively, simply because the alternatives to the American alliance are also difficult? So if you could look at that relationship from both Beijing's perspective and Tokyo's perspective, it would help us.
Certainly, it's an excellent question. My sense from my recent discussions in Tokyo is that there is, across the Japanese elite now, a consensus about what they need to do, whether it's economic reform or security policy. The great problem, of course, in Japan is the complete absence of any political leadership to drive that agenda. But all of my soundings with my friends and counterparts there tell me that they are locked into a process of greater security integration with the United States, precisely because the choices are very, very ugly and getting uglier for Japan every day, not least now with the earthquake disaster. So I don't see any deviation from that. I think Japan will continue to kind of noodle the ball down the field in a generally positive direction. But I'm pessimistic about the political push. From the China side, I think it's really interesting. I think China finds it very hard to read Japan. And I think Japan is going to play more and more of a kind of the role of a political football, unfortunately, in the Chinese debate. I was in Beijing last week as well, and China's always had its issues with Japan, but I think added to those issues now is a kind of contempt for Japan's weakness, for its political weakness and its economic weakness. And I think that's a problem because I think it leads to the risk that Chinese leaders could miscalculate and underestimate Japan. Japan's still, in my view, a very serious country with a very serious determination to maintain its own identity and sort of space. Yeah, back.
Yeah, James Galbraith, local economist. Your premise here seems to be that the West faces a situation of essentially of conflict or potential conflict with China. That is to say that China poses in some sense a challenge to us which must be managed in some way. And I'm wondering why you say that. It seemed to be a premise but not an explained or defended premise. Why would it not be equally plausible to come at this problem by saying that the world has changed, and that the United States, China, Australia, Japan, South Korea are now in a de facto strategic partnership with China, which will only develop and deepen over time. It may leave Europe in a different position than it was before, but one which, that's simply the way the world has now moved, and Latin America, by the way, also being drawn into the orbit of Chinese economic expansion by virtue of its supplying of raw materials and energy to China. Why is this a conflict situation rather than simply a new economic region coming into being?
That's a reasonable question. If I've created the impression that there's some inevitable conflict, then that's a mistake on my part, and I haven't been clear. I think, though, that there is an inevitable strategic competition between the United States and China, and we're seeing that play itself out in a whole lot of realms. I talked a bit about the maritime one. It's happening in regional institutions. It's happening in cyberspace. It's happening in space. It's a multi-layered competition. Now, nor am I denying that there are elements of cooperation in this equation, but I have to say, as someone who watches the region closely, at the moment I see more elements of competition than I see of cooperation, and that concerns me. It doesn't mean I think that there's inevitably going to be a conflict between the United States and China. That's why I put so much emphasis on choice, and I think it's still possible with adept statesmanship on both sides that can be avoided. But I think the notion that there's going to be some alliance between the United States and China is at odds with the data that we have so far about China's behaviour and its preparedness to play by rules which we, I think, all agree are in some cases essential and in many cases highly desirable. So I'm not seeing a China that is. I'm seeing some incremental improvements in China's progress on issues. It didn't veto the Libyan military intervention. It hasn't weakened a set of sanctions against Iran. I mean, these are positive, but they're pretty slim pickings, and I would say they are a long way from the sort of shared strategic outlook and common investment that would underpin the sort of partnership you're talking about as being desirable in China.
It's been said a lot recently that the PLA leadership is increasingly independent of civilian leadership in Beijing. Do you agree with that trend? And if so, what implications do you think it has for the larger strategic competition you're describing?
I think there's no question that the PLA is feeling its oats, throwing its weight around, testing out its new toys. I'm sceptical of the argument that it's really an autonomous actor in China. At the end of the day, the PLA, it's an unusual setup. The PLA constitutionally reports to the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. Its first loyalty is to the perpetuation of Communist Party, one-party rule in China. And after that, you get into things like, border security and deterring threats to China. It's a very different way of looking at military power. And because of that, the importance of the PLA in the Chinese system, I find it difficult to believe that there's a major divergence between the leadership of the PLA and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I'm not saying that at the tactical level there aren't, people exceeding their rules of engagement. But again, I look at a pattern of behaviour from the PLA over the last 18 months. It's quietened down a little bit. And it's also true that not all these maritime incidents involve the PLA. Some of them involve civilian law enforcement, ships and aircraft. But I look at a pattern and I see a pattern of assertiveness. I see rising nationalism in China. Troublingly, when we polled inside China a couple of years ago, it's the younger generation of Chinese that are more nationalistic, more anti-American, more anti-Japanese. Middle-aged Chinese have been through a whole lot of really bad stuff in the past and they're not interested in that. They're worried about food quality and water quality and the environment. It's these younger sort of very internet savvy Chinese that are more and more nationalistic. So I think that has a part to play, and I think that the leadership is at least condoning what the PLA is doing. I don't see this as kind of rogue conduct by the PLA. Frank?
Thanks, Andy. That was a terrific presentation. I have kind of a specific question about the status of the U.S. umbrella alliance and its relationship, both now and historically, with proliferation questions. I was thinking, you laid out a positive scenario, and I was thinking, what if the opposite happens? There's a weakening of the U.S. role, maybe for domestic reasons, North Korea misbehaves, China expands. I wonder if you could give your regional assessment of nuclear proliferation issues. You often see in the proliferation literature issues of tipping points in East Asia being focused. We had some sense in the 60s and 70s in South Korea, Taiwan, even Australia in the 60s had fooled around with this and was connected to concerns about U.S. kingdom defense. And I never know how seriously to take these. What is your expert view of that issue and how kind of potentially different ways it can play out?
I think the first thing to say is that things are very fluid in Asia, much more fluid than at any time in the last half century. And therefore, some of the kind of verities of strategic thinking maybe not quite as strongly founded as we've thought they were. I think Japan's a big one here. I think the whole reassurance, that's why I've put so much weight, I guess, on the reassurance part of this US strategy, as I see it. I think reassuring Japan above everything else is the crux of what America has to do in Asia. And the worst outcome, and I say this to friends in China, is that Japan loses confidence in the US and embarks on, strategically decouples and embarks on its own capability pathway. When I was in Beijing just last week, several Chinese academics said to me, "Oh, isn't it true that I think it was the number 4 reactor at Fukushima has been closed to international inspectors because Japan's running a secret nuclear weapons program?" Didn't those guys with burnt feet have plutonium on them? It's like, where are they getting this stuff from? But I think, they're right to be concerned about that prospect. It's just that all of their action is actually making that prospect more likely, not less likely. I think Taiwan's is undersold too here. There's a view in Australia, certainly in academic circles, business circles, not so much in government, that Taiwan's just this kind of annoyance and gets in the way of America and everyone else having good relations with China, so we should just chuck it overboard. Never mind that it's bigger than Australia and a democracy, bigger in population terms. I think countries, America's Asian allies, will be watching very closely for any sign of a diminution in the US commitment to Taiwan, because they'll be looking at their own alliances through that lens. So when people say you can just throw Taiwan overboard with no consequence, I think they're barking mad. Yeah.
Most of your remarks focused on a strategy for containing China, it seems. And what are the prospects for such a strategy of inducing China to play a more constructive role in addressing issues of common concern like climate change? And I'm kind of curious about your perception of what China's long-run trajectory is for its relationship with the West.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see your views as distinct from our former Dean Jim Steinberg's, or is it a more ambivalent relationship based on the uncertainty of its regime type? I'm not sure what the pathway is that you see from here to there.
Thanks, Josh. The word containment gets kind of thrown out there a lot, talking about China, and there's a whole literature around containment. I would say that I haven't really outlined a containment strategy. I wouldn't characterise it that way. I'd characterise it more as a hedging strategy that seeks to encourage China to move on issues, but also carries out an insurance policy in case it doesn't. And as I said, I think the picture's very mixed. I think there are signs of movement on some issues. We've detected some improvement in the quality of Chinese aid in the South Pacific, for example. There's not so many brown paper bags full of cash being chucked out to local politicians around the South Pacific, and that's obviously something we welcome. But I find it troubling that there's not a genuine buy-in on some of the bigger questions about the future of the region, like the future of the Korean Peninsula. When you talk to Chinese academics, let alone officials, and they just kind of close up like a clam on those things. And those are real issues. I mean, if you can't have that sort of conversation about how Korean reunification might play out hypothetically, then I think you have got a pretty major gap in sort of strategic perception. So I don't think I'm talking containment. I think I'm talking perhaps hedging and balancing, both soft and hard. I don't know if that answers the question, but I wouldn't use the C word myself. I haven't talked to Jim Steinberg recently, but my perception from the outside of US policy is that it's moved quite appreciably in the last 18 months from quite a sort of positive, let's get together and do deals on the big issues like climate change, to a much more kind of sceptical view following Copenhagen and various other problems in the US-China relationship. And I don't see those problems going away. I think the economic problems in particular around the imbalance, global economic imbalance, are going to get worse before they get better. And throw into the mix, sorry to be pessimistic, but throw into the mix Chinese leadership change over in 2012, US elections in 2012, Taiwan elections, Japanese elections in all likelihood, and who knows, even Australian elections, hopefully. Yeah.
You talked about greater cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Australia. I was hoping you could highlight what this sort of trilateral agreement would entail. And is it solely a maritime security effort, as I got that impression?
Well, it already exists. It started out in, I think, 2005 at a senior officials level, where the three countries sit down a few times a year and they basically just talk about whatever's on their agenda. So it'll be topics, and it's a broader agenda than maritime security. So they'll talk about policy towards Korea. They'll talk about Indonesia, for example, and what we can do to to encourage Indonesia's further engagement at the global level and regionally. So it can be quite a big picture conversation. More recently, that's been elevated to the ministerial level, and there's also been the development of a kind of defence grouping which talks about the nuts and bolts of how you do stuff together in practical ways. And there the major focus is disaster relief. And one of the few good things to come out of the earthquake in Japan was that all of that work which has been done on how those countries can work closely together did produce real results on the ground.
So I had a couple questions. One, were you still in the Howard government when the 2007 joint declaration between Japan and Australia was?
Yes, I was.
Okay. I'm kind of curious, was there any behind-the-scenes U.S. involvement in getting that declaration passed or statement?
To be honest, no. I mean, there was...
It was a genuinely bilateral...
Yeah, it was... I'm sure my friends in the US government were aware it was happening, and I'm pretty sure they were happy that it was happening as well, but it was not something that Australia was put up to by the US. In fact, I was the director of the Japan section in the Australian Foreign Ministry in the year 2000, and I wrote a paper saying we should do that and also that we should have a free trade agreement.
So where do you see, well, I mean, last year we signed with you guys the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement. What do you see as sort of the next step in bilateral relations between Japan and Australia?
The next step that's already being worked on is an information sharing arrangement which will make it much easier for us to share intelligence between the two countries, including real-time intelligence and, moving a step towards more of a shared concept of the battle space. And beyond that, I think there's potential in areas like more high-end exercising. Australia's got enormous exercise ranges for air and maritime forces, and I think over the next 5 to 10 years you could expect to see more Japanese forces down there using those ranges. I'd say they're the next big steps.
Can I ask you to look at the map behind you there, which is sort of the typical map with Australia only slightly less peripheral than New Zealand?
We like this over here.
A couple years ago, I was serving in the Fiji Islands, and our sons were going to a local school that had Australian maps with the international date line rather than the prime meridian as the center of the map. And it sounds like the trends that you've described in growing Asia-Pacific economic growth, et cetera, will mean that in 20 years when you come back to give a follow-on or speech here, that we might have the Australian map up there with an Asia-focused central map there. Could that Australian map be here if China doesn't have an 8% growth rate between now and then?
It's a really interesting question. I think the map is going to change in the direction you said. I mean, I don't see China growing at 8% forever. I think, good economists vary widely on when the China slowdown kicks in. Some people are saying as early as 2015. Others have it out, another decade. So when this map changes I'm sounding evasive, but that's because I'm not an economist and I don't know which of those learned estimates is more correct. But it seems to me very clear that gravity is shifting this way. The other thing that's very clear is that economic links between Asian countries are growing really fast. I think 2.5 times as fast as links across the Pacific, trade links. And also a new phenomenon, East Asia links with the Middle East are incredibly important. And in this sense, I think this map's going to look different. In Australia, we're used to thinking about the region as this kind of vertical slice of Asia, essentially maritime Asia. But I think Asia's going to look more kind of horizontal. A couple of my colleagues have written about this, with many more linkages running across mainland Asia, the Asian landmass, a lot going by sea still, but more and more traffic horizontally. So we have to shift our mental maps to think about Indo-Pacific Asia rather than East Asia as we've traditionally done, or the Asia-Pacific. So,
following up a bit on that is your last comment about the Indo-Pacific. Robert Kaplan has written a bit on the coming importance of the Indian Ocean. And would you mind brainstorming a bit about some of the potential implications of Sunday's events in Pakistan with if the conversation since then has not been street-lit or been heartfelt with the Pakistani government, what that might do for Pakistani-Chinese relations, perhaps bringing them closer, perhaps stretching it between Pakistan and the U.S., and what implications that might portend for that region.
yeah, that's a really penetrating question. I mean, first point I'd make is that Australia is kind of, it's a bit bizarre seeing we have, I think it's kind of 5,000 miles of Indian Ocean coastline or something, but we've sort of ignored the Indian Ocean to a large extent. I mean, periodically we focus on it again and then we forget and go back to sort of looking at the Pacific. And we tend to think of the Gulf as over there. So when we deploy forces to the Middle East, which we do on a semi-regular basis, it always confuses our strategists who think that these are kind of out-of-area deployments. I mean, the point seems to me that if you keep doing something like that, then maybe it's not out of area, maybe it's in area, and you need to think about the area differently. And I think we're grappling with that. And to be honest, we're only making baby steps about how we think about Pakistan in that context. I mean, this week back home, there's a big debate about whether Australia should be expanding its training of Pakistani military forces. And it's, I mean, one of my colleagues at the Lowy Institute's come out and basically said that it's pretty clear that the Pakistani government's been sort of in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, and why are we doing this? And I think that relationship is going to come under enormous strain. I think, and I think this is one of those real problems where we've, for very good principled, values-based reasons, not engaged with countries. Take North Korea, take Burma, take Fiji in our neighbourhood. China has been very happy to deal with them and step up its dealings with them, and that I'm sure is a possibility for Pakistan. So I don't have any silver bullets at all for what is, I think, probably the most wicked of all the wicked problems in international policy. So.
You mentioned that the U.S. shouldn't cut defense spending despite our current budget problems, but you also later on went and said that even our closest rival militarily, China, is maybe decades behind us in terms of catching up. What's a guide that you would have then? How do we balance the fact that we spend so very much compared to even our closest rival that we want to see us continue to spend more and keep our strategic advantage?
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, what I'm saying, I'm aware that what I'm saying is kind of in a way easy for an outsider to say, right? You know, don't do these things, do this thing over here. And I've been involved in politics, so I'm not kind of naive about how hard it is to take on entrenched domestic spending programs and so on. My sense, though, is that America needs to do two things. One, as I said, it needs to shift existing resource, the weight, if you like, from one foot to the other of existing resources, and it remains to be seen how far developments in the Middle East make that possible. But that's, I think, part of the answer, and to the extent the Middle East helps that, then that's a good thing. I think the US also has some very difficult decisions about which capabilities it invests in, and Celeste and I have had a lot of discussions about this over the years. But we're certainly, your allies in Asia are watching the declining size of the US naval fleet, and they're watching for signs that that the US is responding to this access challenge in the Western Pacific with new concepts and new systems and so on. So I'm giving you a slightly evasive answer. I don't want to come out with a share of GDP that I think America should spend. But I do think that in the past, when there have been precipitate declines in US defence spending, the results have been very unfortunate, and it's been very hard and painful to get back to where you were. And I've tried to lay out a picture, I think, that points to enough uncertainty, at least, in Asia to warrant prudence when it comes to cutting the US defence budget.
Time for one more question.
Maybe I could follow up on the defense angle, because if you look at the media, clearly a lot of attention is paid to China and the sharp end of the sphere.
Mhm.
Because fifth-ish generation looking fighters and carrier-killing ballistic missiles are certainly sexy, but they don't seem to be paying that much attention to the shaft in China, logistics. One would get the impression that there isn't really anything going on in that regard. And so that would seem to suggest two possibilities. Either they're not interested in being able to project or sustain military power at a distance, or they can't afford to do both for now. How would we tell the difference? And if it were the latter, then what would that tell us about the time frame and the intensity of the competition and what Australia and the United States might do?
Excellent question. I agree that their logistics are underdeveloped, and they're certainly underdeveloped for the sort of force that, if you look at the sharp end, they seem to be wanting to build. As I said in my talk, their level of jointery is also way underdeveloped, and I've not seen compelling evidence that they're able to integrate sensors and shooters in anything like the sort of way they need to. So if you add all of that up, I think there's a degree of show. I think that's what you're sort of alluding to, sort of showmanship about China's military modernisation. I think the key, I come back to Taiwan as a key variable here. If Taiwan remains a separate, I'm not talking about its political status here, but a separate strategic entity, then I think China's preoccupation will remain very much inside that first island chain, as they call it, and patiently building, sort of tightening its web of anti-access area denial capabilities. But if Taiwan kind of flips, then I think you'll see an acceleration of China's power projection aspirations. I mean, we know that China's scholars read Mahan. Now, their logisticians may not have been able to borrow the book from the library, but their aspirations are there. But I think the point that I sense underlies your question is also right, that this is still a long way away. Depending on what happens with Taiwan, it could be 20 or 30 years away. And that's why I'm in favour of this kind of time-buying strategy in terms of maintaining a favourable balance.